I found out she was pregnant by my stepbrother, and her reaction to a DNA test changed everything. My name is Adam, I'm 34, and I've been married to my wife, Emily, 29, for 2 years. Our relationship was one of those stories people call meant to be. We met at a work event several years ago, and what started as a casual friendship quickly grew into something much deeper. After being friends for a couple of years, we realized our feelings for each other went beyond friendship, and we started dating. We were together for 3 wonderful years before I proposed. Those were some of the happiest years of my life. Emily is an incredible woman, smart, funny, and absolutely stunning. She's the kind of person who lights up a room with her smile, and from the moment I met her, I knew she was special. When she said yes, it felt like all the stars aligned. We got married a year later, and our life together has been nothing short of amazing. We live in a cozy apartment in Brooklyn, New York. It's not the fanciest place, but it's ours, and it's filled with love and laughter. We've worked hard to create a life we're proud of. Emily works as a graphic designer, and I'm an accountant. Together, we've built a routine that works for us. Weekend brunches, movie nights on the couch, and trips to visit family upstate. It felt like we had everything figured out. I've always tried to be a good husband. Emily's happiness means the world to me, and I've done my best to support her in every way I can. She's been my partner in every sense of the word, and I never doubted her love for me. That's why, 6 months ago, when my stepbrother Darren, 28, called me looking for help, I didn't hesitate. Darren's always been the wild card in the family. My dad married Darren's mom when I was a teenager, and though we weren't particularly close growing up, we've managed to stay in touch over the years. Darren has a reputation for being impulsive and a bit reckless. He's the kind of person who always seems to be chasing the next big idea, only to abandon it halfway through. This time, Darren had been fired from his job after showing up intoxicated to a work meeting. Instead of looking for a new job, he decided to take some time to figure things out, which essentially meant traveling and living off his savings. When he called to ask if he could crash at our place for a few weeks while he explored New York, I was hesitant. I knew how disruptive Darren could be, and I wasn't thrilled about the idea of him staying with us. But Darren has a way of convincing people, and my dad and stepmom both called me, urging me to help him out. They assured me it would only be for a short time, and that Darren just needed a place to stay while he got back on his feet. I discussed it with Emily, and she, being the kind-hearted person she is, said she was okay with it. Reluctantly, I agreed. Darren arrived 2 months ago, and from the moment he stepped through the door, I made it clear that there were rules. No bringing people over, no late-night disruptions, and no drama. To my surprise, he agreed without complaint. In fact, for the first few days, he seemed like a completely different person. He stayed out most nights, but always came back quietly. He even cooked dinner for us a couple of times and joined Emily and me for conversations at the dinner table. It was almost pleasant. But Darren is Darren, and I knew better than to expect this behavior to last. 2 weeks after Darren moved in, I had a quick work trip scheduled to Las Vegas. It was supposed to be equal parts business and pleasure. I'd give a presentation for my firm on Friday afternoon, and then Emily and I would enjoy the rest of the weekend exploring the Strip. We'd plan dinner reservations and even a show. Nothing too extravagant, just enough to shake up our usual routine in Brooklyn. On Thursday night, though, Emily came down with a nasty stomach bug. She was feverish, weak, and could barely keep her eyes open. When the alarm rang early Friday, it became clear she was too sick to fly. I felt terrible leaving her behind, but it was too late to back out of my presentation. I offered to cancel anyway, but Emily insisted I go. Surprisingly, Darren stepped up, promising to look after her. He'd buy groceries, cook, and make sure she had her medication. Grateful for any help, I caught my morning flight feeling guilty yet relieved she wouldn't be alone. Vegas was a whirlwind. I presented my talk, spent the evening fielding work questions, and tried to call Emily whenever I had a spare moment. Darren sent me a short text, "All good here," which felt strangely formal for someone usually so casual. I flew back first thing Saturday, anxious to see how Emily was doing. She still looked pale but said she felt better, propped up on the couch with a cup of ginger tea. Darren was out, and I didn't bother asking where he'd gone. I was just glad Emily was recovering. Over the next few days, however, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Darren, who previously spent most of his time exploring Manhattan or catching up with friends, started hanging around the apartment much more. At the same time, Emily, normally dedicated to her full-time schedule, began taking half-days or coming home early due to headaches or lingering weakness. At first, I figured she just needed extra rest, but the coincidences multiplied. I'd enter the living room to find them chatting in hushed tones. They'd fall silent the moment I walked in. One afternoon, I decided to surprise Emily by getting off work early. As I reached our floor, the elevator doors opened, and there they were, stepping out together, looking startled. They mumbled excuses about bumping into each other in the lobby. It could have been totally innocent, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Emily became more reserved with me, slipping away to take phone calls in private. Darren, meanwhile, acted unusually polite and cautious, never leaving a mess or complaining about anything. It was as if they shared a secret and were trying hard not to let it show. I wanted to believe I was overreacting. Our relationship had always been built on mutual trust, and Darren was still my stepbrother, despite his reckless past. Yet every new moment of awkwardness chipped away at my peace of mind. I couldn't point to any concrete evidence, only the subtle tension in the air. Deep down, I sensed this was more than post-illness jitters or random coincidences. A few weeks after that unsettling period of hush-hush conversations and strange coincidences, Emily and I found ourselves at the doctor's office for what I assumed was just another routine checkup. She'd been complaining of fatigue and nausea, lingering symptoms from her stomach bug, or so I believed. Truthfully, I was worried about her health, and the doctor's visit seemed like a practical way to ease our minds. What I never expected was to hear the words, "Congratulations, you're pregnant." I remember glancing at Emily in disbelief, trying to process the news. My initial reaction was a surge of joy. I'd wanted to start a family for a while, though Emily always insisted we weren't ready. She wanted to focus on her career and wait a few more years. Suddenly, it felt like the universe had presented us with a little miracle, unplanned but exciting. Emily looked stunned, but she managed to smile. In that moment, I tried to push aside every nagging worry and allow myself a flicker of hope for a new chapter in our lives. However, once we got home, those old doubts crept back in. The timing of this pregnancy felt suspicious. Emily and I had been careful, always using protection because she disliked hormonal birth control. Of course, accidents could happen, but with Darren's sudden presence and our recent tensions, I couldn't ignore the uneasy twist in my stomach. If Emily was already a few weeks along, the math would point straight back to when Darren had been living in our apartment. At first, I fought hard against my own suspicions. I was ashamed to even consider the possibility that this baby might not be mine. Emily had never given me a reason to doubt her, at least, not before Darren arrived. But I couldn't shake the image of them together in the hallway, or the hushed conversations I'd walked in on. With every day that passed, my excitement at becoming a father warred with a sickening uncertainty that gnawed at me. Emily, meanwhile, seemed uncharacteristically evasive whenever I brought up the pregnancy. She expressed excitement and talked about how maybe this was meant to be, but there was a guardedness to her voice. I started noticing she was protective of her phone, or she'd leave the room when taking calls. Each time she did, a sharp pang of doubt stabbed me. I reached my breaking point one evening after a tense, silent dinner. Gathering every ounce of courage, I told Emily I wanted a paternity test. The words felt acidic on my tongue, and I braced myself for the fallout. Her reaction was explosive. Her eyes welled with angry tears, and she accused me of not trusting her, of tarnishing everything we built together. I tried to explain my fears, reminding her of all the strange occurrences since Darren moved in, but she refused to hear it. In her eyes, my request for a test was the ultimate betrayal. As we argued, the apartment that once felt so warm seemed cold and suffocating. Emily raged that I was letting paranoia destroy our marriage, while I insisted that if she had nothing to hide, a test would prove my doubts unfounded. The fight ended with her storming off to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, leaving me alone with the heavy weight of suspicion. In the days following my request for a paternity test, the atmosphere in our apartment was hostile and unrecognizable. Emily and I tiptoed around each other, each interaction charged with anger and pain. She accused me of betraying her trust, while I maintained that my doubts were tearing me apart. I wanted so badly to be wrong. I wanted this baby to be ours, to believe our marriage was still built on honesty. But the gnawing suspicion wouldn't let me rest. Then, one morning, I woke up to find that Emily hadn't come home the night before. I called and texted her throughout the day, growing increasingly worried when she didn't respond. Around mid-afternoon, she finally picked up my call, sounding distant and strangely calm. She announced, almost coldly, that she'd taken care of our problem and assured me there was nothing left to worry about. It took me a few seconds to realize what she meant, that she'd gone and gotten an abortion, entirely on her own. My stomach dropped. I was furious, heartbroken, and confused all at once. Her choice didn't just blindside me. It shattered the last remnants of trust I'd been clinging to. Regardless of my doubts about paternity, I had still imagined the possibility of being a father, of at least confirming the truth and moving forward from there. For Emily to make such a monumental decision without even telling me she was considering it felt like the ultimate betrayal. When Emily returned to the apartment the next day, she acted as though we could now move on, that this solved everything. In her mind, she was removing the source of our conflict. But for me, it only deepened the rift that had formed between us. I couldn't believe that she'd taken such a drastic step without a single conversation, as though my fears and hopes meant nothing. The woman I had loved and trusted for years suddenly felt like a stranger. I tried to speak calmly, but the hurt and anger in my voice were clear. I demanded to know how she could do something so irreversible in secret. She fired back that I'd forced her hand with my obsession over a paternity test, and that she couldn't bear living under constant suspicion. Her words stung, yet they also revealed something cold in her that I'd never seen before. In her eyes, ending the pregnancy was just a way to erase the problem and prove me wrong. An act of twisted self-preservation. At that moment, something in me snapped. I realized that whatever love we once shared had been eroded beyond repair. Trust is the foundation of any marriage, and ours was now built on lies, secrets, and accusations. I told Emily I wanted a divorce. My voice was steady, even though my heart hammered in my chest. She stared at me in stunned silence, then burst into anger, claiming I was overreacting and that we could still fix things. But there was no going back. The woman who stood before me was not the same person I'd pledged my life to. As I packed an overnight bag and prepared to leave, I felt a strange sense of finality. The heartbreak was immense, but at least I knew that this was the only path forward. The life we'd once built together was already gone, and all that remained was the painful task of officially ending it. The night I told Emily I wanted a divorce was the last time we slept under the same roof. Our apartment, once filled with warmth and shared memories, now felt suffocating, like a place haunted by betrayal and heartbreak. When she realized I was serious about ending our marriage, she begged me to reconsider, but there was nothing left for us to salvage. The decision had crystallized in my mind, and I was determined to protect what remained of my sanity. Over the following days, I set the wheels in motion for the divorce. I contacted a lawyer and explained everything: the suspicions, the abortion, and the emotional devastation I was grappling with. My attorney advised me to gather as much evidence as possible and to be prepared for a messy battle. Though I didn't relish the idea of airing my personal life in a courtroom, I knew it was time to be practical. Emily's initial shock turned into anger. She started threatening legal action, hinting that she'd go after my assets and that I'd regret trying to cut her out of my life. It was painful to hear the person I once loved and cherished speak to me like an adversary, but her hostility only hardened my resolve. As soon as I could arrange it, I had the locks changed. I left her belongings packed in the hallway and instructed her to pick them up when I wasn't there. I refused to subject myself to any further manipulation or emotional outbursts. In the midst of this chaos, I made a decision that some might call petty, but I felt I had no other choice. Emily's parents lived in a conservative community in the South, and they had always been very vocal about wanting grandchildren. They'd occasionally complained about how long it was taking for us to start a family, never knowing that Emily was the one who'd wanted to wait. I decided it was time they heard the truth. I called her mother and calmly explained the situation. The affair with my stepbrother Darren, the sudden pregnancy, and the abortion. At first, my mother-in-law refused to believe me. She insisted there must be a misunderstanding or that I was exaggerating. But I laid out the facts as plainly as I could, mentioning everything from the changed behavior when Darren moved into the undeniable timeline of events. I told her I had doctor's reports confirming the pregnancy and that Emily had terminated it without a word to me. The shock on the other end of the line was palpable, followed by tears and anger. My father-in-law called me later that day, apologizing over and over for his daughter's actions. He said he was ashamed and that she be cut off from any future inheritance or family support. It was drastic, but I also sensed the pain in his voice. He genuinely seemed devastated that his daughter would betray her husband and destroy what he believed to be a solid marriage. When Emily found out I told her parents, she was livid. She said I'd humiliated her and that I had no right to bring them into our private matters. I didn't bother arguing. In my mind, her betrayal had already involved too many people. My own father, my stepbrother, and now both of our families. If she was going to face the consequences of her actions, she would do so honestly. All that mattered to me at that point was putting as much distance between us as possible. Once I decided to file for divorce, I knew it wouldn't be as simple as signing some papers and walking away. Emily had already made threats about going after my assets, and I wasn't about to let her capitalize on the chaos she'd created. My lawyer advised me to gather as much evidence as possible: text messages, records of doctor's appointments, and any proof that would show the timeline of events. Though I hated delving into the ugliest parts of my private life, I recognized it was necessary. The real breakthrough came when Darren, my stepbrother and the catalyst for this whole mess, finally admitted to the affair. At first, he tried to dodge my calls and keep his distance, probably hoping to avoid taking responsibility for his part. But when my father made it clear he'd be financially cut off unless he cooperated, Darren changed his tune. He confessed that he and Emily had been intimate during the exact window of time she discovered her pregnancy. Despite the betrayal and my anger toward Darren, his confession was the final piece of the puzzle. My lawyer used his statement, combined with the medical records from Emily's abortion and the timeline of her pregnancy, to build a strong case. In many divorce proceedings, infidelity alone doesn't always guarantee a favorable outcome, but the circumstances, complete with evidence of her affair while we were still living together, certainly didn't help Emily's cause. Throughout this process, Emily's own lawyer tried to paint me as paranoid and controlling. They argued that my demand for a paternity test had driven her to make a drastic decision out of fear and stress. Yet my legal team methodically laid out the facts. Emily had the affair, hid the pregnancy's real origins, and then terminated it without any discussion. Each time her side tried to shift blame, our evidence spoke louder. Eventually, the weight of our case became too much for Emily's lawyer to spin. Faced with proof of her infidelity and Darren's direct admission, they knew pressing for alimony would be an uphill battle. Legally, she was also well-employed and financially stable, which further weakened any argument that she needed spousal support. Realizing a drawn-out court battle would only result in more public scrutiny, plus additional legal fees, she finally agreed to settle. The day the final divorce papers were signed, I felt a strange mix of relief and lingering sorrow. Relief, because I wouldn't be tied to her manipulative actions any longer. Sorrow, because this outcome was the last thing I could have imagined when we stood at the altar, believing we'd grow old together. Still, as I walked out of the attorney's office, I breathed easier knowing that Emily had no legal claim to my home or assets, and that I owed her nothing in alimony. In the end, the divorce decree felt like both a victory and a painful reminder of how fragile trust can be. I'd won my freedom and protected myself from further harm, but I also lost the life I once thought was filled with promise. Even so, I knew I was better off. No more looking over my shoulder, no more doubts. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to think about the future without a hollow pit of dread in my stomach. Life had finally started to settle into something resembling normalcy after the divorce. My apartment, although quieter, felt like a refuge where I could heal. The emotional wounds were still raw, but I was no longer living under the same roof as the memories of betrayal. I focused on my work, tried to reconnect with old friends, and even allowed myself to envision a future without the shadow of my ex-wife's infidelity. In my mind, I was done with all of it, her, Darren, and the turmoil they'd brought into my life. But one Sunday evening, the phone rang. It was my father. He sounded hesitant, as if deliberating whether to speak the words rattling around in his head. Concerned, I pressed him to tell me what was wrong. That's when he shared a bombshell I never saw coming. Darren had moved back to the city and was now involved with my ex-wife, my former partner of 6 years. Once again, they weren't hiding it either. From what my father had heard, they seemed rather open about their relationship. My first reaction was pure shock. As much as I'd suspected they were involved during my marriage, I'd assumed their fling was just a reckless moment of infidelity, an impulsive mistake that tore my life apart. To discover they were actively choosing to be together, even after everything that had happened, felt like a fresh stab to the heart. My father then mentioned that he and my stepmother had confronted Darren, warning him he was on the verge of being disowned if he continued this relationship. Darren, apparently, was undeterred. He claimed he had real feelings for her and was committed to making it work. Hearing this news, I was blindsided by a surge of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt a profound sense of betrayal all over again. It was as though Darren and my ex-wife had taken my trust, my marriage, and my sense of security, crumpled them up, and discarded them without any remorse. Just when I'd begun to stitch my life back together, they managed to rip open the wound once more. I felt used and deceived, and the realization that their relationship was continuing willingly, out in the open, only fueled the hurt. On the other hand, there was also an odd sense of relief woven into my devastation. Their blatant disregard for decency or apology confirmed that I hadn't exaggerated their capacity for betrayal. There was no ambiguity left, no reason to wonder if I'd overreacted during the divorce or if perhaps I'd misunderstood the situation. They were the people I feared they were, two individuals who had no qualms about undermining familial bonds and personal loyalties to get what they wanted. My father, clearly upset, apologized for Darren's actions and promised me he would maintain his support. He insisted I had every right to feel hurt, but he also wanted me to know that Darren's choices were his own. Before hanging up, my father assured me that he was on my side and that he would cut Darren off completely if that's what I wanted. I thanked him, but I couldn't find the words to articulate just how hollow I felt. In the quiet that followed our conversation, I stared at the wall, replaying every memory, both happy and painful. Despite the heartbreak, I realized something crucial. I was finally free. Their decision to be together, out in the open, confirmed there was no salvaging my relationship with either of them. My anger, though sharp, was tempered by the knowledge that I could now move forward without second-guessing my choices. The sense of betrayal lingered, but so did a new clarity. Their actions spoke volumes about who they truly were, and as agonizing as it was to confront, it also freed me to fully close the door on that chapter of my life.